Back in November, Sony announced the Alpha 1 Mark II, the new all-round flagship camera from Sony, and some people were a bit disappointed because it shares some specs with the original A1. So we still have the same 50 megapixel stacked sensor, the camera still shoots 30 frames per second, the viewfinder is the same, and also in terms of video nothing really has changed. However, there are many small tweaks to the camera and also some new features such as the pre-capture that really made a difference for me when I was using the camera out in the field. And after taking more than 10,000 photos of birds and other wildlife, I want to share my experiences with it and maybe give you a recommendation if it might be worth for you to upgrade from the original Sony Alpha 1 or not. So what is actually new with the Sony A1 Mark II? I would say we start on the outside. At the moment you take the body in your hand, you feel that it feels much better in the hand. It's clearly more ergonomic, and that's something I highly appreciate because I was not super happy about how the A1 felt in my hands, especially when I was handling it with a big telephoto lens, using it handheld for a longer period of time. So this is basically the body of the Sony A9 Mark III, and it's exactly the identical body except for the label of Sony A1, and that's really cool because if you use an A9 Mark III and an A1 Mark II in parallel, you can really configure them exactly the same, and basically it doesn't matter which camera you pick up. Like with the original A1, we still have 4 of these dials that you can use for setting shutter speed, ISO, aperture, and for example the exposure compensation if you use auto ISO or whatever mode where you have the exposure compensation. The exposure compensation dial is now not labeled anymore, and the reason behind that is that you can assign it freely for whatever function you want, and I really like to have these 4 dials. I mean, usually 3 is enough for me, but it's nice to have this 4th one for some occasions. What I sometimes still miss is like a small shoulder display to see my settings, because I'm used to turning the screen off just to save a bit of energy. And then it's nice if I just hold the camera in my hand, I can look down and see immediately my settings. With the Sony, I tend to leave the screen on and need to lift the camera and look, but you get used to it eventually. Something else that is new is that the buttons, the C1 and C2 here, they stand out much more, which doesn't look so nice, but it has the advantage that it's much easier to kind of use the buttons if you're wearing gloves. And here, right at my middle finger, is the C5 button. This is the originally called speed boost button from the A9 Mark III. So you can, for example, use this to temporarily increase your drive speed. And this is another change that we have here on the body. On the left hand side, where we have this selection of drive speeds, we now have this asterisk or this star. And if we go to this one, it means that basically we set in the menu which frame rate we want and not on the dial. And that's also something cool, that it really helps to quickly change between different frame rates. Out in the field, if you have a slower scene, you can dial it down with one press of a button, and pressing this button again and it goes up to the full 30 frames per second. The photo video switch is also new. Before, the video mode was just on the mode dial. Now you have here a small switch that you can operate, and I find this much more convenient than turning the dial here, so that's also welcome. We still have the same card slots, which are these dual use slots, so dual card slots, dual use. You can put either 2 CF Express Type A cards, you can put 2 SD cards, or of course 1 CF Express Type A, 1 SD. I would highly recommend to use CF Express Type A cards. They are quite expensive, unfortunately, but they are really much faster, and especially with this camera, especially with 2nd generation, you really don't want the SD card to be limiting. We also still have the same battery, which is good news for all of you that already have some of these batteries laying around. It's the NPFZ100. I think battery life is quite okay. It takes a hit with every camera where you use the pre-burst. I noticed this with the A1 Mark II. I also noticed it with my R5 Mark II. That's quite normal. What we have new is the charger. It's a dual charger, but it's still very compact. I think it's still smaller than my R5 Mark II charger, which only takes one battery. And it charges in parallel, and even better, it has a USB-C plug, so you can plug this to your power bank, to your car, or if I'm in public transportation in the bus, I can also plug it to this USB-C outlet there, so that's really cool. If you want a bit longer battery life directly in the camera, you can use the vertical grip. It's again has all these new controls, also this C5 button, and I was using it most of the time also because I prefer it for the handling when shooting vertically. But this morning when I was taking some pictures of waterfowl at the lake, I actually took it off so that I could go a bit lower and not put this too much in the water. And what I really like about Sony cameras is how customizable they are. You can almost put every function on every button. If you come from Nikon, it's already an improvement, and if you come from Canon, it's a huge improvement. My R1 has two buttons that I cannot reconfigure. It's the position of the C1 and C2 button, basically. I think for a Sony user it will be hard to even imagine this, so it's so great that what you can configure here. You can really set up the camera exactly how you want it. As I mentioned before, if you have an A9 Mark III, it's amazing that you can have two identical bodies. And with the new menu system, I also find it a bit clearer or easier to set it up. The viewfinder is the same as the original A1, so it has a very big magnification of 0.9. Maybe to compare, the R5 Mark II has a magnification of 0.76, and the Z8, Z9 from Nikon have one of 0.8, so this is much bigger. It also has a quite high resolution of, I think, around 9.4 million dots. However, if you put it in the high frame rate mode, not even in the highest, but just in the high, it drops significantly. The image is still sharp enough, but for some weird reason, the numbers and the balance, the electronic level, they look a bit pixely, like digitalized. It doesn't look so clean anymore. It's not a big deal, and overall I still prefer the viewfinder of the A1 Mark II over the R5 Mark II, just because the A1 Mark II is clearly so much bigger. Of course, it's also blackout free. I think my favorite viewfinder at the moment is still the one of the R1. It has the same magnification as the Sony, but it is much crisper and somehow more natural. It's a bit hard to describe, but yeah, that's how I feel about it, but this one works excellent. And my highlight here is actually the new screen. First of all, they increased the resolution to around 2.1 million dots, which is nothing crazy. It's more or less standard, I would say, amongst the flagship cameras at the moment. But the way they built the screens, because you can basically move this one in every direction you want. Up, down, to the bottom, completely to take pictures from yourself from the front, and up for vertical, and that's just amazing because it offers the best of both worlds. My R5 Mark II and also my R1, all the Canon cameras have this screen that just goes out. And the problem here is if I'm like shooting waterfowl and I look down on the screen, it's harder to find and follow the subject because I don't look over the optical axis. I look in a bit weird angle on the screen, which is not where the bird is. And this makes it harder to follow, and sometimes here you don't even have the space because there is some vegetation, a rock or whatever. So this screen design, this implementation from Sony is really the best ones I've ever seen, and I wish that every Canon and Nikon camera would also have a screen something like this. Let's get to the sensor and image quality. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, it's the same 50 megapixel stacked sensor that the original A1 already had, and some people were disappointed by that. But honestly, this sensor is amazing. Because last year when using the A1, I really noticed that first of all with 50 megapixels, obviously you have a lot of detail, but the sensor also has a lot of dynamic range, and I noticed that the noise levels were actually slightly below my R5, and even more so below the R5 Mark II, and also below the Nikon Z8, Z9. So it's an amazing sensor. It's faster than the stacked sensor of the R5 Mark II. It's about the same speed than the Z8 and Z9 from Nikon. So I completely see why Sony kept this sensor. It's kind of a class-leading sensor. The only faster sensors to my knowledge are the Canon R1 and the Sony A9 Mark III, and both of them are like only 24 megapixels. So totally makes sense to keep the sensor. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's really an excellent sensor. One interesting thing that I noticed when I was comparing the R5 Mark II and the A1 Mark II side by side was that somehow the images of the A1 Mark II came out half a stop darker than the one of the R5 Mark II. When I was taking the pictures in the field, I just assumed it's the display or the viewfinder that is set differently, but when I imported them at home, it was a confirmation that the one of the Sony are, for some reason, half a stop darker. I think in this situation it was not the lens, because I used 300mm 2.8 lenses. I don't think there should be a half a stop of difference there. My best guess is that maybe you know this, but basically all manufacturers cheat a bit with the ISO, because not even if you set 800 ISO on every camera, the actual ISO will vary a bit, and I have the feeling that Sony is deviating a bit more here, but that's just a guess. So if you know why the Sony files get out darker, please let me know in the comments. So Sony implemented this AI chip that is kind of responsible for the autofocus calculations into the A1 Mark II, and this gives us some improvements with the autofocus. First of all, we now have a proper automatic mode that can automatically detect the type of subject that you're shooting, and you can also deselect some options. So if you, for example, do all type of wildlife photography, you can leave the mammal, bird, insects on, but maybe you can turn off the cars and the people recognition, or however you want to configure it. And there is also a combined bird and mammal setting, and I was using this the whole time, and within this combined setting you can say if you want to give priority to the mammal or to the bird, and I put it to bird priority, and it was still going perfectly fine with when I was taking pictures of squirrels. I was actually impressed how quickly it just jumped to the head of the squirrel and stayed there. So I was very impressed and happy about that, because this was a bit annoying before, that I always needed to switch between mammals and birds. In terms of subject recognition, I had a bit mixed results. So sometimes I was taking pictures with a bit like medium size or large zone, and the camera would just not find the subject. Even though I was in one situation, I was taking pictures of some songbirds in the snow, and I would say the focus was just 5 or 6 centimeters off. So I focused with the camera, and I was expecting it would detect the bird, but for some reason it just focused on the snow. I have no idea why. So my workaround here was just to use the expand spot autofocus. Then I needed to aim a bit more where the target was, and then once it had acquired the subject, I went to the tracking that I put on the AF on button, and this workaround worked, but it really required to aim a bit more for the target. And I was hoping that the subject recognition would now also work more reliable over a bigger area. I was taking some pictures this afternoon at the local river, and I wanted to try to take some pictures of seagulls, also using one of these zones, and you can see here what I mean. I'm trying to focus and the camera just goes on the waves in front of the bird and doesn't detect the bird, even though I think it should be quite easy. If I switch to the expand spot AF, it worked perfectly, but it's a bit more annoying. If you compare it to the R5 Mark II that you can see now, this one had no problem at all to find the subject even when using a really large zone. What was kind of weird is that afterwards I really focused on the background, and I tried to focus on seagulls that were flying much closer to me and were really out of focus, and the camera grabbed them without any problem. So it's kind of weird. I would have expected that this is a much more challenging situation for the camera, and it grabbed it without problem. On the other hand, just a bird on a lake, I needed to take the spot autofocus because the recognition would not work over a larger zone. So I hope that maybe this can still be improved via firmware, because the fact that it can handle difficult situations. Actually, this morning I was taking pictures in backlit and the camera performed perfectly, or very good. I would say better than my R5 Mark II. So it can sometimes master very, very challenging conditions, and sometimes it has more struggle in what seems to me easier conditions. So maybe this can still be a bit tweaked, I don't know. The tracking itself, once the subject is recognized, works very well, and I would say maybe even slightly better than with my Canon cameras. Where both my Canon R5 Mark II and the A1 Mark II still struggled was really when taking pictures of small songbirds. like tits or finches that were taking off and flying like not directly to me, but also not directly parallel, but in a weird angle. Especially the first few frames were often blurry. I think this is just where all of the cameras at the moment are still a bit struggling, but I still managed to get some songbirds in flight with the A1 Mark II, such as this Alpine S-Hunter, and I'm quite happy with the shot. As I mentioned before, the camera shoots up to 30 frames per second with continuous autofocus. However, this only works if you use the compressed RAW. With the uncompressed RAW, you are limited to 20 frames per second. And also to get these 30 frames per second, you need to use a compatible Sony lens. So there's a selection of lenses on the Sony website that work. However, to be honest, I think everybody who buys the A1 Mark II will have one of these compatible lenses. The list is not so restrictive, but I just wanted to mention it. One new thing with the A1 Mark II, and this is a really big thing, is the pre-capture that we have in RAW. And it's implemented basically perfectly, in my opinion. So first of all, you can decide how much of a pre-capture you want. So from the moment you half press the shutter, it starts taking pictures but keeps them in the buffer. And then when you fully press, it starts recording plus some shots before, and you can say how much time before it should record. You can go from something as short as 0.03 seconds all the way up to 1 second. I prefer something 0.3 or 0.4 seconds. And the other nice thing is that you can just customize a button to turn on and off the camera, the pre-capture, and that's also very handy. So actually I had one button that turned on and off this speed boost that it switches from 20 to 30 frames per second. I had one assigned for pre-capture on-off, one for the zebras on-off, and with this I felt like I could basically use most of the stuff that I needed, and I used the lens function button for changing the autofocus areas. And with this I was very happy with the setup. And if you play back the images on the screen or the viewfinder afterwards, the camera actually shows you which one is from the pre-capture series and which one is from the actual release. I think in the long term that's not so important, but it can be nice to if you want to figure out how much pre-capture you want to dial in, if it's maybe 0.3, 0.5 or maybe 0.8 seconds. The video specs seem almost unchanged, but there are some changes under the hood that are quite important, I think. First of all, as I mentioned before, this photo-video switch that is really nicely implemented. You still have this direct drag button if you want to quickly snap a video. Another thing that I really like is that now you have the animal or bird eye detection also in video mode, and this makes it so much easier to film wildlife. If you know my style of shooting, I don't like tripods. I think the only time I usually use tripods is if I put them in the river, as in this shot here, but otherwise I try to shoot handheld. And I always felt that Nikon had by far the best stabilizer in video when doing handheld. For some reason, for photography, they were at the same level almost as Canon, but for video they were much better. I felt like Canon with the R5 Mark II and the R1, they almost caught up to Nikon. I would still give the edge to Nikon, but they are very close. And Sony was, for me, unusable with super large, super telephoto lenses to handhold video, and this has definitely changed. The IBIS is improved now. It's supposed to be 8.5 stops in the center of the image, and I think 7 stops in the edges and corners, and you can really feel it. I don't know how much in photo, because here I could not do a direct comparison, but in video it was a day and night difference. I'm not sure if it's still a little bit lagging behind Canon or not, but it's a big difference. And with the 300mm lens, also with the 1.4 extender, so having 420mm, I was able to handhold video and the footage was actually usable. So this was really great for me. So as you have probably realized, I had really fun using the Sony A1 Mark II. There are some small things that would be nice to be a bit improved. Again, maybe some of these things like the autofocus can still be tweaked via a firmware update, but overall it's a fantastic all-round flagship camera. Not an all-rounder that is affordable for everybody, but for a flagship camera, amazing. And I think many people will also appreciate that you have this flexibility of using a battery grip or not using a battery grip as you want in this situation. The question is it the right camera for you? I think if you don't have a flagship camera yet, maybe you have a Sony A7 Mark III, A7 Mark IV, and you want now this stacked sensor, better autofocus, faster frame rate, pre-capture, I think the A1 Mark II is perfect. I would not go for an A1 just because the pre-capture already makes such a difference for me. I would definitely go for the A1 Mark II. How is it if you already have an A1? Is it worth the upgrade? I think here it's basically exactly the same answer that I have when people ask me the same about the Canon R5 and then upgrading to an R5 Mark II. Basically, if you shoot landscape, macro, slower moving mammals or slower moving birds, then no, I don't think it's worth upgrading. You're not getting better image quality, the autofocus and frame rate is more than enough for these situations. However, if you do a lot of video, then you will definitely enjoy the better autofocus and the image stabilizer, and the pre-capture is so nicely done and you have a better autofocus. So if you do really a lot of action photography, flying birds, fighting birds, especially smaller fighting birds, then I think the A1 Mark II is worth the upgrade. I linked it down below, and if you would buy over this link, you would support my channel. One interesting thing that I saw with Canon and Sony, at least in Switzerland where I live, the R5 Mark II was actually around $200 cheaper than the original R5, and for the Sony A1 Mark II the price when it launched was $1,200 lower than the A1 when it launched back in 2021. So these cameras are both a bit evolutions, but these refinements can be well worth it, I think. Let me know what you think below in the comments. Thanks for watching, and then see you in the next video.